A swan song to Old Britain. The 1950s marked the last decade of Old Britain, when women were housewives, men smoked pipes and schoolboys sported caps and shorts. Whose TV history of post-war UK starts on Tuesday. Between the fall of Attlee's Labour government and the return of Labour under cocky Harold Wilson, Britain went through a time which some believe to be a golden-tinted era of lost content. To millions of others these were the grey, conformist, 13 wasted years of Tory misrule. It seems that today's British, when they think about the 50s, cannot decide whether to idealize or to mock. This is for a good reason. Before the arrival of the 60s and rebel consumerism, this was for the last time truly a different country. People still looked different. No schoolboy was without a cap and shorts, every woman is a housewife, hair cream, corsets, and pipe tobacco are advertised everywhere. Hats and mustaches adorn Mr. Average. Britain was still a military nation, whose generals were famous public figures, and whose new jet bombers provoke gasps of pride. National service, which was introduced by Attlee in 1947 to replace wartime conscription and began properly at the beginning of 1949, would last until 1963, bringing more than 2 million young British men into the forces. Spirit of the 40s. This was a huge, often underestimated, social force. It brought all classes together at a young and vulnerable age, subjecting them to ferocious discipline, often to privation, and sometimes to real danger. Some of the anti-authority anger and sarcasm of British plays and novels derived directly or indirectly from national service, but so did the habits of polishing, dressing smartly, and conforming to authority in millions of homes. In general, it probably kept some of the spirit of the 40s going for a decade longer than would otherwise have happened. The return of Winston Churchill, and so many familiar faces from the war years, and before suggested that, as many middle-class people hoped, the country really could return to the moral order and professional hierarchies they vaguely recalled before the war. Hanging, the physical punishment of young offenders, strong laws against abortion, and homosexual behavior by men, all these framed a system of control that was muttered against, or subverted, but not much openly challenged. Tough action by the Home Office and the police against crime had produced clear results. The country was, at one level, orderly. Patriotism was proclaimed publicly, loudly, and self-consciously, in a way that would quickly become hard to imagine. In the early 50s, Britain was a worldwide player, connected and modern. Australia, New Zealand and South Africa were promoted as places for holiday cruises or emigration. A British California, the new frontier? Nation reborn. This was not a country which has closed to foreign influence, far from it. But the influences seemed as strong from Italy or Scandinavia as from America. Coffee bars, Danish design, scooters, and something promoted as Italian Welsh rare but later widely known as pizza were all in evidence. This is a time when the idea of powerful, self-confident, independent Britain, independent of American culture, seemed not only possible but likely. Per capita, Britain was still the second richest major country in the world. After the 1953 coronation of the new Queen, there was much talk, albeit slightly self-conscious, of the new Elizabethan age, a reborn nation served by great composers, artists, and scientists. In retrospect, the world-class musical talents of Vaughan Williams and Benjamin Britten, and the great poets of the age, W. H. Auden and T. S. Eliot, partly vindicated this prediction. In popular culture, the steady rise of television brought, at first, a traditionalist English upper-crust view of the world to millions of homes. This was the age of Andy Pandy and gardening tips, of Joyce Grenfell and Noel Coward. It was also the time of Roger Bannister and his 4-minute mile, the conquest of Everest, triumphs in yachting and football. Even in the world of adventure and sport, Britain was doing well. With Nobel Prize-winning science in physics and biology, there was no sign yet of the brain drain of scientists to the United States. To be British was something to be proud of. Even the mild hooligan element was homegrown. The exotic and expensive costumes of the Teddy Boys, with their velvet collars, long jackets, and foppish waistcoats, were modeled on English Edwardian dress. Land of restraint. The future, as it seemed to many in the early 50s, would have seen Britain as a more egalitarian, but also conservative country, cozy and fair. As the world economy recovered after the war, employment was high and inflation, though quietly growing, was relatively low. Houses were being built in their tens of thousands, year by year, and whole new towns were emerging from the mud. This was the Britain remembered fondly by so many older people. In the early 21st century, a land of restraint, decency, untainted by the material and other excesses to come, a nation of carefully washed cars, clipped hedges, pressed trousers, and shiny toe caps, of old hymns in old churches and patriotic children's comics reaching out to a better future. There is a lot of truth in the caricature, but this was also the Britain of frustrated, bored, resentful people being shouted at, and a country being ruled by complacent, out-of-touch cliques. These were busy, bustling years in global politics, and at home there would be resignations and scandals aplenty. Yet there has never been a time in modern history when government seemed less relevant to what was happening in the country. The new welfare state settlement created by labor was mostly left alone. Of the controversial nationalizations, only a couple were reversed. The rising power and militancy of the trade unions was not confronted. No great changes were made to government spending, and, therefore, to overall levels of taxation. To a child in the 1950s it was like we had arrived too late for one strange, massive party, the Second World War. There were countless artifacts, like air raid shelters, old gas masks, seaside concrete defenses, and redundant ration cards, to remind us, but apart from some bombed-out displaced persons still in old army camps, the misery was much more distant to us than it would have been to a German child, for instance. Everything was compared to before the war, or during the war, and, although we could dimly perceive our parents might have suffered, the John Mills film heroics somehow made it all seem normal, and actually concealed the real achievement of our parents' generation in standing up to Nazi Germany. I think this is one reason why the Monty Python generation went on to ridicule that type of Britishness. We weren't laughing at our parents, but at their shell-shocked disbelief at what they had been through and survived. Our generation supplied the slightly hysterical laughter.